My daughter-in-law said I had failed as a mother in front of everyone at her wedding. I just went home in silence. My son didn't even send me a message. They had no idea about the inheritance I received from my husband. They didn't get a single cent of my $70. But that night, driving home alone from what should have been one of the happiest days in our family, I wasn't thinking about money. I was thinking about how completely invisible I had become in my own son's life. The wedding had been beautiful. I'll give Sarah that. She'd planned every detail with military precision, from the ivory roses cascading down the altar to the string quartet that played during dinner. 300 guests filled the grand ballroom of the Riverside Country Club, and everything sparkled under crystal chandeliers that probably cost more than most people's cars. I'd worn my best dress, navy blue with pearl buttons, the one Michael always said made me look elegant. I'd even gotten my hair done at that expensive salon downtown, wanting to look perfect for my son's special day.
Before we continue, comment where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. We'd love to see how far our stories are reaching.
I should have seen it coming during the rehearsal dinner when Sarah barely acknowledged my presence. She swept past me with that practiced smile she reserved for people she considered obligations rather than family. But I told myself she was just nervous. That brides are entitled to a little stress before their big day. I'd been making excuses for Sarah's behavior for 3 years, ever since Michael brought her home and announced they were serious. The ceremony itself was lovely. Michael looked so handsome in his tuxedo, standing at the altar with tears in his eyes as Sarah walked down the aisle. For a moment, watching my son's face light up with joy, I forgot about all the small slights and casual dismissals. This was my boy, the child I'd raised alone after his father died. The sweet little boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms and tell me I was the best mommy in the whole world. But it was during the reception toasts that everything changed. Sarah's father had spoken first, welcoming Michael to their family with warmth that made my chest ache. Then it was Michael's turn to thank everyone, and he spoke beautifully about love and commitment and how grateful he was to have found his soulmate. He thanked his new in-laws for raising such an amazing woman. He thanked his groomsmen for their friendship. He even thanked the wedding planner for making the day perfect. He never mentioned me. Not once. Then Sarah stood up, champagne flute in hand, that radiant bride's smile lighting up her face. "I have so many people to thank tonight," she began, her voice carrying beautifully across the silent room. "But most of all, I want to thank the woman who taught me what it means to be a real mother." My heart lifted for just a moment. Maybe she was going to surprise me, acknowledge me publicly after all the tension between us. "Mom," Sarah continued, turning to face her own mother at the head table, "you showed me every day what it means to love unconditionally, to put your children first, to sacrifice everything for their happiness. You taught me that being a mother isn't about being perfect, it's about being present. It's about showing up for your children, not just when it's convenient, but especially when it's hard." The words hit me like ice water. Sarah's eyes found mine across the room as she continued. "Some people think that just giving birth makes them a mother. But you taught me that real motherhood is earned through years of devotion, consistency, and putting your child's needs above your own." Every word was carefully chosen, each phrase designed to cut without seeming to. The guests were smiling and nodding, thinking they were hearing a beautiful tribute to maternal love. They had no idea they were witnessing a public execution. "So thank you, Mom," Sarah concluded, raising her glass toward her mother, "for showing me what real maternal love looks like, for never missing a school play, never being too busy for a phone call, never making me feel like I was asking too much just by needing my mother." The applause was thunderous. People were dabbing their eyes with napkins, moved by what they thought was a heartfelt tribute. I sat frozen in my chair, my untouched dinner growing cold in front of me, feeling like everyone in the room could see my inadequacy written across my face. Michael was beaming, raising his glass to toast his new mother-in-law. He caught my eye briefly across the room and smiled that same proud smile he'd worn all evening. Either he genuinely didn't understand what had just happened, or he'd chosen to ignore it entirely. Both possibilities made me feel sick. I don't remember much about the rest of the evening. I smiled when people spoke to me, danced once with Michael's college friend when he asked politely, and managed to hold myself together until it was acceptable to leave. When Michael hugged me goodbye in the hotel lobby, he whispered, "Thanks for everything, Mom. This was perfect. Perfect." The word echoed in my mind as I drove home alone through the dark streets. My son's wedding had been perfect, and I had been perfectly irrelevant. The house felt enormous when I walked through the front door. 28 years I'd lived here, first with Robert, then alone after he died when Michael was just 15. The silence pressed against me like a weight. I hung up my dress, that beautiful navy blue dress I'd chosen so carefully, and sat on the edge of my bed in my slip and stockings, finally allowing myself to really feel what had happened. The tears came then, hot and silent, and full of a grief I didn't fully understand. I wasn't just crying about Sarah's words, though they burned like acid in my memory. I was crying for all the ways I'd been slowly erased from my son's life, all the times I'd swallowed my hurt to keep the peace, all the moments when I'd felt like a stranger in my own family. 3 days passed, 3 long days during which I waited for my phone to ring, for Michael to call and ask if I'd gotten home safely, if I'd enjoyed the wedding, anything that would prove I still mattered to him. The silence stretched on, broken only by a brief text message. "Thanks again for coming to the wedding. Sarah and I really appreciate it." That was it. Not a phone call, not a visit, not even a question about how I was feeling. Just a polite, distant thank you that felt more like a dismissal than gratitude. Sitting in my kitchen on that third morning, staring at my coffee growing cold while I reread that impersonal text message, something shifted inside me. For the first time in years, maybe decades, I started to see clearly. The son I'd devoted my life to, the child I'd sacrificed everything for, the boy I'd raised to be kind and thoughtful and loving, he was gone. In his place was a man who saw me as an obligation at best, an embarrassment at worst. And somewhere in my bedroom closet, locked away in a safe that Michael didn't even know existed, sat documents that would have changed everything if he'd only known how to love me the way I'd loved him. The 4th day brought no relief. I found myself checking my phone constantly, hoping for some sign that my son remembered I existed. Instead, I discovered something that made my stomach turn. Sarah had posted wedding photos on social media, dozens of them, all carefully curated to tell the story of their perfect day. There I was in exactly 3 pictures. 3. Out of what must have been 50 photos of family moments. In 2 of them, I was barely visible in the background, and in the 3rd, I looked like exactly what I'd become, an awkward afterthought standing alone at the edge while the real family clustered together. The captions stung worse. Under a photo of Sarah dancing with her father. Dancing with the man who taught me what love looks like. Under a group shot of her family. Surrounded by the people who shaped me. Under a picture of Michael with his new in-laws. So grateful he's found a family that truly understands him. I wasn't tagged in a single photo. It was as if I'd never been there at all. I closed the laptop, feeling something cold settle in my chest. This wasn't accidental. Sarah was rewriting history in real time, creating a narrative where I simply didn't matter. The phone rang then. For just a moment, my heart leaped. Maybe it was Michael, finally calling to check on me. But the caller ID showed my neighbor Margaret's name. "Amelia, dear. I saw some lovely photos from Michael's wedding online. I was a bit surprised, though. I only saw you in 1 or 2 pictures. Were you feeling all right that day?" Margaret meant well, but her innocent question hit like a knife. Even my neighbor had noticed my absence from my own son's wedding photos. "I'm fine, Margaret. Just trying to stay out of the photographer's way." After I hung up, I found myself walking through the house, really looking at it for the first time in months. Every room held memories of Michael growing up. The living room where he'd built blanket forts, the kitchen where we'd made cookies every Christmas morning. This house had been filled with love once. After Robert died, it had just been Michael and me against the world. We were a team. I worked 2 jobs to keep us afloat, but I never missed a parent-teacher conference, never skipped a baseball game, never let him doubt that he was the most important thing in my world. When had that changed? When had I become someone he was ashamed of instead of proud of? I found myself in his old bedroom, which I'd kept exactly as he'd left it. His high school trophies still lined the shelves, His graduation photo sat on the nightstand next to a picture of him and Robert from a fishing trip they'd taken just months before the cancer got bad. Sitting on his twin bed, I let myself remember the son he used to be, the boy who would run to hug me when I came home from work, the teenager who'd insisted on taking me to dinner for my birthday every year with money from his part-time job. He had called regularly in college for a while. Every Sunday evening, we'd talk for an hour about his classes, his friends, his plans. But somewhere during his junior year, the calls became shorter, then monthly. Then they virtually stopped altogether, replaced by brief texts and occasional emails. I'd told myself it was normal. Boys grow up, they build their own lives. But looking back now, I could see the pattern. The gradual distancing hadn't been natural maturation. It had been preparation. Michael had been slowly cutting ties long before he met Sarah, and she'd simply finished the job. The worst part was remembering how grateful I'd been when he'd introduced her. Sarah was beautiful, educated, from a good family. She seemed to adore Michael, and he was clearly smitten. I'd welcomed her with open arms, thrilled that my son was happy. I should have paid attention to the warning signs. The way she'd subtly correct me when I'd tell stories about Michael's childhood, as if my memories were inaccurate. The way she'd change the subject when I'd mention family traditions. The way she'd look at me sometimes when she thought I wasn't watching, like she was studying a problem she needed to solve. Sarah was smart. She never said anything directly critical. Instead, she worked quietly, systematically, to marginalize me in my son's life. A suggestion here, a comment there, always framed as concern for Michael's well-being. Your mother calls so often. Don't you think that's a bit much for a man your age? Maybe we should spend Christmas with my family. Your mom seems like she could use some time to herself. And Michael, sweet, trusting Michael, had absorbed it all without question. He'd started seeing my calls as intrusions instead of connections. My invitations became obligations. My love became suffocating instead of nurturing. 6 days after the wedding, my phone finally rang with Michael's name on the display. My hands shook as I answered. "Hi, Mom. How are you doing?" Even his voice sounded different. Careful. Distant. "I'm fine, sweetheart. How was the honeymoon?" "Great. Listen, I wanted to call because Sarah mentioned that you seemed a little upset at the reception. She's worried she might have said something wrong during her speech." I closed my eyes. Of course. Sarah wasn't apologizing. She was managing the situation, making sure I wouldn't cause problems. Her speech was beautiful. I said quietly. Good. She was really worried. You know how she gets about wanting everyone to feel included. Included. The word was laughable. "Michael, can I ask you something?" "Sure. Do you remember when you were 12 and broke your arm falling off your bike?" There was a pause. "Yeah. Of course. Do you remember how I sat with you in the emergency room for 6 hours? How I slept on that uncomfortable chair next to your bed because you were scared?" Another pause. Longer this time. "Mom, where is this going? Do you remember how I worked double shifts for 3 months to pay for your baseball camp?" "Mom, my point is that I was there, Michael. For every scraped knee, every heartbreak, every triumph, I was there. I didn't miss school plays or make you feel like you were asking too much by needing your mother." The silence stretched between us like a chasm. Finally, he spoke. And his words broke my heart all over again. "That was a long time ago, Mom. Things are different now." When I heard the dial tone, I knew that my son was truly gone. In his place was a stranger who saw my love as a burden and my sacrifices as ancient history. But as I sat there in the growing darkness, I realized something else. I was tired of being treated like I didn't matter. I was tired of swallowing my hurt to keep everyone else comfortable. It was time to stop waiting for Michael to remember who I was. It was time to remember who I was myself. And maybe it was time to remember what Robert had left me, locked away in that safe upstairs, waiting for the moment when I finally understood that some people never deserved the gifts they were given. The safe had been Robert's idea. Hidden behind a false panel in our bedroom closet, he'd installed it himself the year before he died. "For important documents," he'd said simply, never explaining why he felt the need for such secrecy. I'd assumed it was just his cautious nature. After his funeral, I'd locked away his papers without really reading them. The grief was too fresh, the legal language too complex. His lawyer had handled everything, the will that left everything to me, the life insurance policies, the business assets. I'd signed where he told me to sign and trusted that Robert had taken care of everything. But that night, after Michael's devastating phone call, I found myself standing in front of that safe for the first time in years. My hands trembled as I entered the combination. Our wedding date. The same numbers Robert had used for everything important. The metal door swung open with a soft click, revealing stacks of documents I'd tried to forget existed. And there, at the bottom, a manila envelope with my name written in Robert's careful handwriting. For Amelia. To be opened only when you need to understand. I'd never noticed that envelope before. How had I missed it? Sitting on our bed, I opened it with shaking fingers. Inside were 3 letters, each dated differently, each sealed separately. The first was dated just after Michael's high school graduation, the second, 2 years later. The third, written weeks before Robert's death. The first letter was vintage Robert, methodical, practical. He'd been quietly building wealth for years, he explained. Not through his modest accounting practice, but through careful investments, real estate purchases made under corporate names, partnerships in businesses that most people never knew he owned. I grew up poor, Amelia, and it made me hungry. But I've seen what money does to children who never had to work for anything. I want Michael to earn his own way first, to understand the value of things before he inherits what I've built. The numbers made my head spin. Even then, 15 years ago, Robert's net worth had been well into the millions. Properties in 3 states, stock portfolios, business investments, all carefully hidden behind trusts and corporations. The second letter was darker in tone. Robert had been watching our son's behavior, and he was concerned. Michael had become entitled, careless with money, dismissive of people he considered beneath him. Robert had seen him treat waitresses rudely, watched him expect expensive gifts without gratitude. I'm worried we've failed him somehow, Amelia. He's becoming someone who believes his worth comes from what he has, rather than who he is. I'm changing my will. Everything will come to you when I die, and you can decide if and when he's ready for that responsibility. But it was the third letter that broke my heart all over again. Written weeks before the cancer finally claimed him, Robert's handwriting was shaky, but his words were crystal clear. He'd been listening, he wrote, listening to phone conversations between Michael and Sarah, listening to their casual discussions about waiting for the inheritance, about how they planned to use the old lady's money to buy a bigger house, take expensive vacations. They don't know I can hear them from the den when they talk on the back porch, Robert wrote. But I've heard enough. Sarah talks about you like you're already dead, Amelia. She makes jokes about your cooking, your clothes, your simple way of thinking. And Michael just laughs. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely hold the paper steady. I've made my decision. The will leaves everything to you with no restrictions, no requirements to pass anything along. You've been my partner in building this wealth. Even if you never knew the full scope of it, you sacrificed your career to raise our son and support my business. If Michael proves himself worthy, if he shows genuine love and respect for you, then you can choose to include him. But if he continues down this path, if he treats you like a burden, then the money will die with you. I've set up a charitable foundation that will inherit everything if you die without changing the will. The letter detailed the full scope of Robert's estate. $70 million. $70 million. Spread across investments and properties and businesses I'd never even known existed. I'd been living modestly on the small pension from Robert's accounting practice, careful with every dollar, while sitting on a fortune that could have bought me anything I wanted. Robert had arranged it that way deliberately. The pension was enough to live comfortably, but not enough to change my nature or attract the wrong attention from Michael. I thought about all the times I'd hesitated to buy something because it seemed too expensive. All the times I'd made excuses for not traveling because I was on a fixed income. All the times Michael and Sarah had looked at me with that mixture of pity and condescension reserved for elderly relatives who'd outlived their usefulness. They thought I was poor. They thought I was dependent on their occasional visits and hollow gestures of affection. They thought they were humoring a lonely old woman who had nothing to offer but guilt trips and outdated motherly advice. If only they knew. I spent the rest of the night reading through Robert's other documents, bank statements showing accounts I'd never accessed, investment reports charting the steady growth of wealth I'd never touched, property deeds for real estate in Colorado, Florida, and California that I'd never even visited. Robert had been protecting me, I realized, not just from the corrupting influence of wealth, but from the pain of seeing what Michael would become if he'd known about the money. My husband had understood, even before I did, that our son had developed a mercenary heart. By morning, I'd made my decision. I would do exactly what Robert had empowered me to do. Nothing. I would continue living as I always had, giving Michael and Sarah no reason to suspect that their casual cruelty was costing them more money than they could imagine. But I would also start living for myself in ways I'd never allowed myself before. Robert had built this wealth partly through my sacrifices, my unpaid labor, my willingness to put family first always. It was mine to enjoy, mine to use as I saw fit. And if Michael wanted to continue treating me like an embarrassing obligation, then he could do so knowing that his inheritance was shrinking with every dismissive word, every ignored phone call, every public humiliation. Sarah's speech at the wedding had been worth about $70 million. I realized. I wondered if she'd consider that a fair trade. The foundation Robert had established would do more good with our money than Michael ever would. I could already imagine the scholarships for disadvantaged students, the programs for elderly people who'd been abandoned by their families. At least then, someone would benefit from all the love I'd poured into raising a son who'd forgotten how to love me back. Outside my bedroom window, the sun was rising on what felt like the first day of the rest of my life, a life where I finally understood my own worth, both emotional and financial. It was a revelation that changed everything. Doors swung open with a soft click, revealing stacks of documents I'd tried to forget existed. Robert's death certificate, insurance papers, stock certificates from companies I'd never heard of. And there, at the bottom of the pile, a manila envelope with my name written in Robert's careful handwriting. For Amelia, to be opened only when you need to understand. I'd never noticed that envelope before. How had I missed it? Sitting on our bed, my bed now, I opened it with shaking fingers. Inside were 3 letters, each dated differently, each sealed in its own smaller envelope. The first was dated just a month after Michael's high school graduation, the second 2 years later. The third, written just weeks before Robert's death. I opened them in order. The first letter was vintage Robert, methodical, practical, concerned about our future. He'd been quietly building wealth for years, he explained. Not through his modest accounting practice, but through careful investments, real estate purchases made under corporate names, partnerships in businesses that most people never knew he owned. He'd kept it secret, he wrote, because he didn't want money to change who we were or how Michael saw the world. I grew up poor, Amelia, and it made me hungry, but I've seen what money does to children who never had to work for anything. I want Michael to earn his own way first, to understand the value of things before he inherits what I've built. The numbers in that first letter made my head spin. Even then, 15 years ago, Robert's net worth had been well into the millions. Properties in 3 states, stock portfolios, business investments, all carefully hidden behind trusts and corporations. The second letter, written when Michael was 20, was darker in tone. Robert had been watching our son's behavior, he wrote, and he was concerned. Michael had become entitled, careless with money, dismissive of people he considered beneath him. Robert had seen him treat waitresses rudely, watched him expect expensive gifts without gratitude, noticed how he spoke about his college friends who worked part-time jobs. I'm worried we've failed him somehow, Amelia. He's becoming the kind of man I never wanted him to be, someone who believes his worth comes from what he has rather than who he is. I'm going to change my will. Everything will come to you when I die, and you can decide if and when he's ready for that responsibility. But it was the third letter that broke my heart all over again. Written just weeks before the cancer finally claimed him, Robert's handwriting was shaky, but his words were crystal clear. He'd been listening, he wrote. Listening to phone conversations between Michael and his girlfriend Sarah, listening to their casual discussions about waiting for the inheritance, about how they plan to use the old lady's money to buy a bigger house, take expensive vacations, live the lifestyle they felt they deserved. They don't know I can hear them from the den when they talk on the back porch, Robert wrote. But I've heard enough. Sarah talks about you like you're already dead, Amelia. She makes jokes about your cooking, your clothes, your simple way of thinking, and Michael just laughs. Our son, the boy we raised to be kind and respectful, laughs while the woman he plans to marry mocks his dying father's wife. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely hold the paper steady. I've made my decision. The will leaves everything to you with no restrictions, no requirements to pass anything along. You've been my partner in building this wealth, even if you never knew the full scope of it. You sacrificed your career to raise our son and support my business. You deserve to control what happens to the fruits of that sacrifice. If Michael proves himself worthy, if he shows genuine love and respect for you, if he becomes the man we hope to raise, then you can choose to include him. But if he continues down this path, if he treats you like a burden or an inconvenience, then the money will die with you. I've set up a charitable foundation that will inherit everything if you die without changing the will. Either way, Michael will have to prove he deserves our legacy, not just expect it. The letter went on to detail the full scope of Robert's estate. $70 million? $70 million. Spread across investments and properties and businesses I'd never even known existed. I'd been living modestly on the small pension from Robert's accounting practice, careful with every dollar, while sitting on a fortune that could have bought me anything I wanted. Robert had arranged it that way deliberately. The pension was enough to live comfortably, but not enough to change my fundamental nature or attract the wrong kind of attention from Michael. I thought about all the times over the past few years when I'd hesitated to buy something I wanted because it seemed too expensive. All the times I'd made excuses for not traveling or updating the house because I was on a fixed income. All the times Michael and Sarah had looked at me with that mixture of pity and condescension reserved for elderly relatives who'd outlived their usefulness. They thought I was poor. They thought I was dependent on their occasional visits and hollow gestures of affection. They thought they were humoring a lonely old woman who had nothing to offer them but guilt trips and outdated motherly advice. If only they knew. I spent the rest of the night reading through Robert's other documents, bank statements that showed accounts I'd never accessed, investment reports that charted the steady growth of wealth I'd never touched, property deeds for real estate in Colorado, Florida, and California that I'd never even visited. Robert had been protecting me, I realized, not just from the corrupting influence of wealth, but from the pain of seeing what Michael would become if he'd known about the money. My husband had understood, even before I did, that our son had developed a mercenary heart. By morning, I'd made my decision. I would do exactly what Robert had empowered me to do. Nothing. I would continue living as I always had, giving Michael and Sarah no reason to suspect that their casual cruelty was costing them more money than they could imagine. But I would also start living for myself in ways I'd never allowed myself before. Robert had built this wealth partly through my sacrifices, my unpaid labor, my willingness to put family first always. It was mine to enjoy, mine to use as I saw fit. And if Michael wanted to continue treating me like an embarrassing obligation, then he could do so knowing that his inheritance was shrinking with every dismissive word, every ignored phone call, every public humiliation. Sarah's speech at the wedding had been worth about $70 million, I realized. I just wondered if she'd consider that a fair trade. The foundation Robert had established would do more good with our money than Michael ever would. I could already imagine the scholarships for disadvantaged students, the medical research funding, the programs for elderly people who'd been abandoned by their families. At least then, someone would benefit from all the love I'd poured into raising a son who'd forgotten how to love me back. Outside my bedroom window, the sun was rising on what felt like the first day of the rest of my life, a life where I finally understood my own worth, both emotional and financial. It was a revelation that changed everything. The first thing I did was buy myself a new car. Not because I needed one, my 10-year-old Honda ran perfectly fine, but because I wanted one. For the first time in my adult life, I walked into a dealership and bought something simply because it made me happy. The salesman was surprised when I paid in cash. A silver Lexus SUV, leather seats, all the modern features I'd never thought I needed. As I drove it home, I realized I was crying. Not from sadness this time, but from the overwhelming relief of finally doing something purely for myself. It had been 3 weeks since I'd found Robert's letters. 3 weeks since the last phone call with Michael. In all that time, he hadn't reached out once. No apology for hanging up on me. No attempt to rebuild the bridge he'd burned with his cold dismissal of my sacrifices. His silence told me everything I needed to know. I'd spent those weeks quietly making changes. Small ones at first. Expensive groceries I'd always considered too extravagant. Books I'd wanted to read. A subscription to the premium cable channels. Then bigger ones. I hired a housekeeper, something I'd never allowed myself because it seemed wasteful. I booked a cruise to Alaska, the trip Robert and I had always planned but never taken. Each purchase felt like an act of rebellion against the modest, self-denying woman I'd been for so many years. The woman who'd put everyone else's needs first, who'd lived on a tight budget while sitting on millions, who'd accepted crumbs of affection from a son who saw her as nothing more than an obligation. The financial advisor Robert had used was a woman named Patricia Wells, someone I'd met only briefly at the funeral. When I called her office and explained who I was, the change in her voice was immediate. "Mrs. Henderson, of course. Robert spoke of you often. I've been wondering when you'd be ready to discuss your portfolio." My portfolio. The phrase still felt foreign. Patricia's office was in downtown, all glass and marble and the kind of understated elegance that whispered of serious money. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe 50, with silver hair pulled back in a perfect chignon, and the kind of quiet confidence that came from handling other people's fortunes. "Robert was very specific about his instructions," she said, spreading documents across her polished conference table. "He wanted you to have complete control over the estate, but he also wanted you to understand your options." She walked me through everything. The real estate holdings that generated rental income I'd never even known about. The stock portfolio that had grown by nearly 20% since Robert's death. The business investments that provided steady dividends. "The foundation he established is structured to receive everything upon your death, assuming you don't change the will," Patricia explained. "But you have absolute discretion to modify those arrangements at any time." "What if I wanted to start enjoying some of this money while I'm still alive?" I asked. Patricia smiled. "Then I'd say it's about time. Robert always hoped you would. He used to say you were too generous for your own good, too willing to sacrifice your own happiness for others." That afternoon, I did something I'd never imagined possible. I bought a house, not to live in. I loved my home too much to leave it, but as an investment. A beautiful Victorian in San Francisco that Patricia said would appreciate nicely. I signed the papers with a hand that barely trembled, transferring more money than I'd ever imagined having. Walking out of that office, I felt transformed. Not just by the money, but by the power it represented. The power to make choices, to say no, to stop accepting scraps of affection from people who should have cherished me. That evening, I called my sister Helen in Phoenix. We'd grown apart over the years, partly because I'd been so focused on Michael, and partly because she'd gotten tired of hearing about his achievements while her own children struggled. "Amelia, is everything okay?" Her voice was surprised. I rarely called anymore. "Everything's fine. Better than fine, actually. I was wondering if you'd like to take a trip together." "A trip? Where?" "Anywhere you want. Europe, maybe. Or we could do that Mediterranean cruise you mentioned last Christmas." There was a long pause. "Amelia, can you afford that? I mean, with your pension and all?" I smiled, thinking about the numbers Patricia had shown me that afternoon. "Let me worry about the money. What do you say? Just us girls, like when we were young." Helen's excited agreement was worth every penny I'd spend on the trip. We talked for over an hour, planning and laughing in a way we hadn't in years. After I hung up, I realized how long it had been since I'd felt this kind of uncomplicated joy in another person's voice. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. I was in my garden, planting the expensive roses I'd finally allowed myself to buy, when a car pulled into my driveway. My heart jumped, hoping it might be Michael, finally ready to apologize. Instead, It was Sarah. She climbed out of her car slowly, looking around at my yard with the kind of calculating assessment I'd grown to recognize. She was dressed casually, but expensively. Designer jeans and a sweater that probably cost more than my old monthly grocery budget. "Amelia, hi. I hope you don't mind me stopping by unannounced." I stood up, brushing dirt from my gardening gloves. "Of course not, Sarah. What brings you by?" She gestured toward the driveway, where my new Lexus sat gleaming in the morning sun. "I noticed you got a new car. It's beautiful." "Thank you." I waited, knowing there was more coming. "I also heard from Margaret next door that you're planning some trips. A cruise," she said. Of course Margaret had mentioned it. News traveled fast in our neighborhood, especially when it involved someone doing something unexpected. "That's right. My sister and I are going to Europe next month." Sarah's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "That's wonderful, really. I'm sure you've been saving for something like this for a long time." There it was, the fishing expedition wrapped in false enthusiasm. Sarah was trying to figure out where I was getting money for luxuries that seemed beyond my supposed means. "Actually, I haven't been saving at all," I said pleasantly. "I just decided life's too short to put off the things that make you happy." "Oh, well, that's a lovely attitude." Sarah shifted uncomfortably. "Michael and I have been talking, and we feel bad about how things ended after the wedding. He's been under a lot of stress with work, and I think he may have been a bit short with you on the phone." A bit short. That's what she called his cruel dismissal of my sacrifices, his cold rejection of my love. "These things happen," I said neutrally. "We were hoping we could take you to dinner this weekend, just the three of us, to clear the air." I looked at this woman who'd systematically worked to erase me from my son's life, who'd stood at her wedding reception and publicly humiliated me, who was now offering me a dinner invitation like a charitable gesture to the deserving poor. "That's very kind of you to offer," I said, "but I'm afraid I'm busy this weekend. And next weekend too, actually. Helen and I have a lot of planning to do for our trip." Something flickered in Sarah's eyes. Surprise, maybe, or irritation. She wasn't used to being turned down, especially not by someone she considered socially and financially inferior. "Oh, well, maybe when you get back from your trip then, maybe." After she left, I stood in my garden for a long time, thinking about the conversation. Sarah hadn't come to apologize or to genuinely reconcile. She'd come to investigate, to figure out why the poor old woman was suddenly acting like she had money to spend. That evening, I made another call. This time to a lawyer Patricia had recommended, someone who specialized in estate planning. "I want to make sure my will is exactly what I want it to be," I told him. "And I want to understand all my options for how I distribute my assets." For the first time in my life, I was planning for a future that belonged entirely to me. A future where I mattered, where my choices had weight, where I didn't have to accept cruelty disguised as love. Michael and Sarah wanted to clear the air? They could do it with each other. I had better things to do with my time, like learning how to live the life I deserved. The call came 2 months later, just as Helen and I were returning from our Mediterranean cruise. We'd spent 3 weeks visiting Italy, Greece, and France, staying in the kind of hotels I'd only seen in magazines. Helen had cried when she saw our suite in Rome, overwhelmed by the luxury I was suddenly able to provide. "I can't believe you're doing this for me," she'd whispered, standing on our private balcony overlooking the Colosseum. "We're doing this for us," I'd corrected her. "We deserve beautiful things, Helen. We've earned them." And we had. 2 women in their 60s, finally free to live without apology or restraint. I'd never felt so alive. But the magic of the trip evaporated the moment I heard Michael's voice on my answering machine when I got home. His tone was different now. Urgent, almost panicked. "Mom, I really need to talk to you. There's been some complications. Can you call me back as soon as possible? Please." 3 more messages followed, each one more desperate than the last. Sarah had left messages too, her usually controlled voice betraying stress. "Amelia, we really need your help with something. It's about Michael's job situation. Could you please call us back?" I unpacked slowly, letting them wait. Whatever crisis had prompted this sudden attention could simmer a little longer. They'd managed to ignore me for months. They could manage a few more hours. When I finally called, Michael answered on the first ring. "Mom, thank God. Where have you been? I've been trying to reach you for weeks. I was traveling with Helen. We went to Europe." A pause. "Europe? For how long?" 3 weeks. It was wonderful. We saw the Vatican, the Greek islands, had dinner in small cafes in Tuscany. I'd forgotten how much I loved travel. 3 weeks in Europe. His voice trailed off, and I could almost hear him calculating the cost in his head. "Mom, we need to talk. In person. Can Sarah and I come over tonight?" The desperation in his voice was palpable. Whatever had happened, it was serious enough to crack his usual indifference toward me. "Of course, but I should warn you, I'm quite tired from the trip. I won't be able to visit for long." They arrived an hour later, and the change in them was immediately obvious. Sarah's designer clothes looked wilted, and there were dark circles under her eyes that no amount of expensive concealer could hide. Michael looked like he'd aged years in the months since the wedding. "Mom, you look," he started, then stopped, studying my face. "You look really good. Rested." I was wearing a new dress I'd bought in Florence, silk in a deep blue that the boutique owner had said brought out my eyes. My hair had been professionally styled in Rome, and I'd finally indulged in the kind of skincare products I'd always considered too expensive. Travel had given me a glow that no amount of worry could produce. "Thank you. The trip was exactly what I needed." Sarah was looking around my living room, taking inventory. She'd noticed the new furniture I'd bought before leaving. Nothing ostentatious, but quality pieces that replaced the worn items I'd lived with for years. "Your house looks different," she said carefully. "I've made some updates. At my age, I decided I should surround myself with things I actually enjoy." Michael shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Mom, about that, about your finances, we're a little confused about how you're affording all these improvements." There it was. The real reason for their visit had nothing to do with missing me or wanting to repair our relationship. They were here because my newfound financial freedom threatened their assumptions about my place in their world. "I'm managing fine, Michael. You don't need to worry about your old mother." "But the car, the trip, the furniture," Sarah leaned forward. "Amelia, we're family. If you've come into some money somehow, we should know about it. For tax purposes, if nothing else." I almost laughed. For tax purposes. As if I were some confused elderly woman who might accidentally commit fraud without their guidance. "My finances are quite in order, thank you." Michael ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I remembered from his childhood when he was frustrated. "Mom, I need to be honest with you. I lost my job 3 months ago." The admission hung in the air like a confession. "I'm sorry to hear that." "Sweetheart, what happened?" "Budget cuts. The whole marketing division was eliminated." He looked down at his hands. "We've been living on Sarah's income and our savings, but it's not enough. The mortgage payment alone is more than Sarah makes in a month." Now I understood. The expensive house, the luxury cars, the lifestyle they'd built expecting his high salary to continue indefinitely. Without his income, their carefully constructed image was crumbling. "Have you been looking for another position?" I asked. "Every day. But nothing at my salary level. Everything I've been offered is at least 40% less than what I was making." Sarah spoke up, her voice tight with barely controlled desperation. "We've had to make some difficult decisions. We're probably going to lose the house, Amelia. And with Michael's employment gap getting longer, it's going to be harder and harder for him to find something suitable." They sat there looking at me expectantly, waiting for me to offer the solution they'd come seeking. The elderly mother, opening her modest purse to rescue the children who'd treated her like an embarrassment. "That sounds very difficult," I said sympathetically. "What do you think you'll do?" Michael's face darkened slightly. "Well, we were hoping. We thought maybe you could help us figure out some options." "What kind of options?" "Financial options." Sarah's facade finally cracked, revealing the calculation beneath. "You're living alone in this big house, spending money on cruises and cars you don't really need. Michael is your son, your only child. Surely you'd want to help him through a rough patch." The entitlement in her voice was breathtaking. Even now, even asking for my help, she couldn't resist lecturing me about my spending choices. "I see." I stood up slowly, smoothing my new dress. "You know, I'm quite tired from the trip. Perhaps we should continue this conversation another time. Michael looked panicked. Mom, wait. We're not asking for charity. This would be a loan. We'd pay you back as soon as I find new employment. With what collateral, Michael? You just told me you're losing the house. The question hung between us, stark and uncomfortable. They wanted my money based on nothing more than blood relation and a presumption of obligation. We're family, Sarah said, as if that explained everything. Yes, I agreed. We are. And family members treat each other with respect, love, and consideration. They don't dismiss each other's sacrifices or publicly humiliate each other at weddings or hang up on phone calls when memories become inconvenient. The color drained from both their faces. They also don't disappear for months at a time, only to reappear when they need something. I continued gently. Real family shows up for the good times and the bad times, not just for the desperate times. Michael opened his mouth to argue, but I held up my hand. I think you should go now. When you're ready to have a real conversation about our relationship, not about money, but about how we treat each other, then we can talk. Until then, I hope you figure out your employment situation. I'm sure something will work out. As they left, Sarah's composure finally shattered completely. This isn't over, Amelia. Michael deserves better than this from his own mother. I watched them drive away in their expensive car, heading back to their expensive house that they couldn't afford, still believing that I owed them something simply because we shared DNA. They had no idea that with every entitled demand, every manipulative tear, every assumption about my obligation to rescue them, they were costing themselves millions. And the most beautiful part was that they still had no idea how much they'd already lost. The diagnosis came on a Tuesday morning in October, exactly 1 year after the wedding that had changed everything. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer, the doctor said gently. The same disease that had taken Robert. 6 months? Maybe less? I sat in his office feeling strangely calm. After everything that had happened this past year, death didn't frighten me anymore. I'd already lived through the death of the relationship that mattered most to me. This was just the body catching up with what my heart had already endured. Are there people you need to call? Dr. Martinez asked kindly. Family members who should know? I thought about Michael and Sarah, who hadn't contacted me once since their desperate visit 3 months ago. They'd probably heard through neighborhood gossip that I'd been traveling again, this time a solo trip to Scotland that I'd taken purely for my own pleasure. I'll handle the notifications, I told him. That afternoon, I called Patricia Wells and scheduled an appointment. Then I called the lawyer Robert had recommended. Finally, I called Helen, who cried, but didn't try to talk me into aggressive treatments I didn't want. How much time do we have? She asked through her tears. Enough, I said. More than enough for what I need to do. I waited 2 weeks before calling Michael, not out of cruelty, but because I needed to be certain about my final decision. I needed to be sure that what I was about to do came from clarity, not anger. When I finally dialed his number, he answered on the first ring. They must have been screening calls from debt collectors. Mom, is everything okay? His voice carried that same note of desperate hope it had held during his last visit. They were probably still struggling, still waiting for me to come to my senses and rescue them. I'd like you and Sarah to come for dinner this Sunday, I said calmly. There's something I need to discuss with both of you. Of course. Yes. What time? 5 o'clock. And Michael, this will be our last conversation for a while, so please come prepared to actually listen. Sunday arrived gray and cold. The kind of autumn day that makes you grateful for warm houses and family meals. I'd spent the morning cooking Michael's favorite dishes from his childhood, pot roast, mashed potatoes, green beans with almonds. If this was going to be our goodbye, I wanted him to remember the mother who had loved him, not just the stranger he'd created in his mind. They arrived precisely on time, both looking nervous and hopeful. Sarah had dressed carefully, probably hoping to make a good impression for whatever favor they were planning to ask. Michael looked thinner than when I'd last seen him, stress etched in the lines around his eyes. Mom, this smells incredible, he said, and for just a moment I glimpsed the boy he used to be. We ate mostly in silence, the weight of unspoken things heavy between us. Finally, as I cleared the dessert plates, I decided it was time. "I have cancer," I said simply. The fork dropped from Michael's hand with a clatter. Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "What? When? How bad is it?" Michael's voice cracked like it had when he was 13 and afraid. "Pancreatic cancer, stage 4. The same thing that killed your father. I have maybe 6 months." Michael stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. No, we'll get you the best doctors. Treatment. Whatever it costs, we'll figure it out." I smiled sadly. "With what money? Sweetheart, you can't even afford your own mortgage." The harsh reality stopped him cold. Sarah was crying now, but I couldn't tell if it was from genuine emotion or the realization that their last hope of financial rescue was disappearing. "There are clinical trials," Michael said desperately. "Experimental treatments. Mom, you can't just give up." "I'm not giving up. I'm choosing how I want to spend my remaining time, and that brings me to why I asked you here." I walked to the living room and retrieved the manila folder I'd prepared. Inside were copies of Robert's letters, bank statements, and my updated will. "Your father left me quite wealthy, Michael. Much wealthier than you ever imagined." I placed the documents on the dining room table and watched their faces as they absorbed the numbers. $70 million. Properties across 3 states. Investment portfolios they'd never known existed. Sarah's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. Michael stared at the papers like they were written in a foreign language. "I don't understand," he whispered. "You've been living so modestly. You let me think you were struggling. I was living exactly as I chose to live. Your father structured things so I could live comfortably on his pension while keeping the bulk of the estate protected. He did that because he'd overheard you and Sarah talking about how you planned to spend the old lady's money." Michael's face went white. "Mom, that was years ago. We were just fantasizing. We didn't mean—" He heard Sarah making jokes about my cooking, my clothes, my simple way of thinking. He heard you laugh while the woman you planned to marry mocked your dying father's wife. The color drained from Sarah's face. "That's not— I never meant— Robert changed his will because of what he heard. He left everything to me with complete discretion over how it would be distributed. He trusted me to decide if you'd earned the right to inherit his legacy." Michael sank back into his chair, the full implications beginning to dawn on him. "What did you decide?" I looked at my son, this man I'd raised and loved and lost somewhere along the way. "I decided to honor your father's wishes. The money will go to charity, all of it." The silence that followed was deafening. Then Sarah exploded. "You can't do this. Michael is your son, your only child. You can't give away his inheritance to strangers." "I can, and I have. The papers are already signed. When I die, the foundation your father established will receive everything. They'll use it for scholarships, medical research, programs for elderly people who've been abandoned by their families." Michael was staring at me with something approaching horror. $70 million. You're giving away $70 million. I'm giving it to people who will appreciate it, people who understand the difference between love and obligation. Sarah was on her feet now, pacing frantically. "This is insane. You're punishing us for things that happened years ago. People say thoughtless things sometimes. That doesn't mean we don't love you." "Love?" I repeated the word quietly. "When was the last time either of you showed me love without wanting something in return? When was the last time you called just to see how I was doing? When was the last time you treated me like someone who mattered?" Michael's face crumpled. "Mom, please, we can fix this. We can do better. Give us another chance." "I gave you a chance, Michael. For an entire year after that wedding, I gave you chances. Every time you ignored me, dismissed me, treated me like an inconvenience, you were making a choice. You chose Sarah's opinion over your mother's feelings. You chose pride over love. You chose money over family." I stood up, feeling suddenly exhausted. The irony is that if you'd simply treated me with kindness, if you'd shown even basic respect for the woman who raised you, you would have inherited everything. All you had to do was love me. Sarah made one last desperate attempt. "We do love you. We're here, aren't we? We came when you called. You came because you thought I might have something you needed, just like always. I walked to the front door and opened it. I think it's time for you to leave. I'm tired, and I have a lot to do before. Michael stood up slowly, his movements those of an old man. At the door, he turned back to me one last time. Mom, I'm sorry. I know I haven't been the son you deserved, but please don't do this. There has to be some way. There was, I said gently. For 32 years, there was a way. You just chose not to take it. After they left, I sat in my living room surrounded by the silence I'd grown to love. Outside, the first snow of the season was beginning to fall, covering the world in clean white peace. I thought about Robert, and how proud he would be that I'd finally learned to value myself the way he'd always valued me. I thought about the scholarships that would send deserving students to college, the medical research that might spare other families the pain of cancer, the programs that would ensure lonely elderly people felt valued and loved. $70 million would do a lot of good in the right hands, in grateful hands, in hands that understood that wealth wasn't an entitlement but a responsibility. Michael and Sarah would never understand that. They would grieve for the money they'd never had, rage about the inheritance they'd never deserved, and probably never realize that they'd possessed something far more valuable than wealth. They'd had my unconditional love. They'd just never learned to recognize its worth until it was too late. But I was at peace with my choice. For the first time in years, I was completely, utterly at peace.